When you came back to vocal music in '75, Elizabeth Bishop, A Mirror on Which to Dwell, it was because you had better singers?
Well, what had happened was, in the interim, I had become a fellow of the American Academy in Rome. And in Rome at that time, there was a very good chorus that sang with the radio, with the Rome Radio Orchestra. And I heard very advanced pieces that I thought no chorus could ever possibly sing. Luigi Nono's Canto Sospeso, for instance, which when I looked at the score, I couldn't imagine that anybody could. And here were people singing it, and singing it really very accurately. And that encouraged me when I began to hear that. I thought, well, I will write what I want, and maybe somebody will be able to play it, be able to sing it someday. And actually, I was commissioned to write A Mirror on Which to Dwell by the Speculum Musicae. And I did what was considered rather advanced even in those days for Americans, but it was something that Europeans had conquered long ago. You see, Webern was a composer that influenced a great many composers during that time, but not in America, except for Milton Babbitt.
No, we really sort of separated from Europe for a while, maybe forever, I'm not sure, during the 50s and 60s when composers went different directions.
Oh, yes, well, of course. But the basic problem always is, I'm sorry to say, is that in the end, the Europeans, at least a good measure of the Europeans that are involved in music, consider it as part of their education. In this country, it tends to be considered as an entertainment, and therefore, the music has to be written so that the public will accept it. In Europe, the public goes to hear the concert and they don't understand it, but they think it's part of their education.
Well, you know, even in America, people are accepting your music much more than they used to because there's a great interest now.
Yeah, it's because so many younger people than I am have gone to write music somewhat like this. And then there's been a good deal of emphasis on contemporary music in recent years. And as a result, the public has begun to see that we're not as crazy as they thought.
Well, really good performances make a difference. I've often thought that one of the big problems between the audience and so-called advanced music was that they weren't actually hearing it played well. And so they thought maybe
well, that was another, of course, that was a very important thing. There were, after the Second World War, a whole group of conductors, Barenboim, Levine, and Boulez, who were determined to play contemporary music very, very well. And when it's played very well, it's very convincing, at least. Of course, it always has been for me, but I heard, you know, I became interested in and wanted to be a composer when I heard the Writers' Spring in Carnegie Hall, conducted by Monteux, I think. Half the audience walked out. And I don't imagine it was a very good performance, but I loved it.
It changed your life. You said once that you started
my life completely.
You started backwards. You started at the modern
Well,
age.
you see, I was all involved with modernism even at that time. I mean, I had friends. A woman over here on Third Avenue used to give Sundays playing Chris Scriabin's music, which I knew, and I knew Edgar Varese quite well. I'd met him in his speakeasy during the time of Prohibition. And so I had been involved with modernism from the very early part of my adolescence.
New York must have been such an amazing place in those times, with Varese living here, and of course Copeland and Sessions, and all sorts of writers, painters, and filmmakers.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not so sure it isn't like that now. I mean, it's a very lively place. Of course, it's the one place that aspiring artists come in the hope of finding a public that they will appreciate them. In fact, I believe that New York is gradually losing its center as the sort of central point of artistic endeavor. I think this is obviously a lot of it has changed to go to the West Coast, to Los Angeles and California, and even to Chicago, so that I think that it would be a good thing if New York had competitors.
New York has to compete.
Yeah.
Well, we're hearing this season at the New York Philharmonic of Rewaking, William Carlos Williams' poetry, and let's talk for a minute about that piece. This set is 3 songs, 3 orchestral songs, and they're quite different from each other. They have very different characters and even different shapes.
Oh, yes.
The first one, the Rewaking, is a very kind of
it's a love poem.
Cantabile singing style of music, beautifully written for the voice, very singable kind of music.
Well, I hope so. Yes. I wanted to, and I felt that the second one, of course, is a stormy piece. It's called Lear, and it refers slightly to King Lear, but it's mainly about storms at sea and the storms in people's lives. And then the last one was one that interested me mainly because the idea of shadows, which was something that had something to do with the kind of music I wrote, in which there were different kinds of things superimposed on each other. And it seemed to me this idea of motions of shadows was something that would interest me a good deal. And I tried to deal with this so that is not so cantabile. It's a little more broken up in style than the other. Of course, the first and last poems are joined together by the idea of the rose, which in these particular poems, the rose is a symbol, or I don't know if you call it a symbol. It represents the life of the imagination, and he at the very end of the last poem, he talks about the rose as bringing back a lively imagination, which God knows we all need it if we can get it.
I thought that poem Shadows was in a way perfect for Elliott Carter because you have to be thinking 2 thoughts at once or doing 2 things at once. And so that's the way your music very often works, and especially in that movement, it's a little bit different than the first 2, with a kind of conversation between tranquil, gentle music and quite lively, energetic music.
Yes, and of course, it's in 2 halves. The first half is about night, and then the second half is about the daytime. And it's interesting that William Carlos Williams thought of the day as pushing the shadows away and pushing away actually the life of the imagination, that it brought you back to the notion of history, the notion of memory, and even the memory of previous imaginary things. And it was only when the rose finally reaches him that he then finally returns to the real life of imagination.
That last song, Shadows, it's also by far the biggest musical number. It's I think 8 minutes or so.
Good night.
Practically half the piece.
Gee.
So it seemed to me it functions as a kind of finale, that the whole 3-movement form has a kind of form of its own too, that builds up.
Yeah, well, I'm not a very methodical person, and I get ideas as they come along. And I believe that when I wrote the first one, I didn't think I was going to write the last one. Mm-hmm. You know, the music always leads you astray. It leads you to itself, and as a result, it led actually the idea to have the Lear poem, which is a very interesting poem because the idea is that the sea is feminine and boats are masculine, and that in old boats they had a picture of a woman on the bow of the boat, which makes this curious ambiguity,
Yes.
which was very interesting in the poem.